In movies, the Wild West looks like one long highlight reel. Fearless gunfighters, lawless towns, and outlaws with perfect one-liners. Real life was rougher, more practical, and often way less dramatic than the legends. In this video, we're going to take apart 10 myths that still shape how people picture the Old West and replace them with what historians and real records actually show. How towns worked, how people stayed safe, and why the stories got exaggerated in the first place. If you've ever wondered what the frontier was really like behind the posters and Hollywood scenes, you're in the right place. Number 1. High noon duels. Movies trained us to expect a fair showdown. Two people, one empty street, hands hovering near holsters, a single shot that ends it. In real American Old West towns, that kind of formal quick-draw duel was the exception, not the rule. Most violence didn't follow rules, and it didn't happen for style points. If someone got shot, it was usually up close, sudden, and messy in the social sense. Arguments in crowded places, drunken disputes, ambushes, or people firing from cover. There are a few famous moments that look like the movie version, like the 1865 Hickok-Tut shootout in Springfield that's often described as a duel, but that's remembered precisely because it's unusual. Even the most famous gunfight in Wild West pop culture, the OK Corral fight in Tombstone, wasn't a noontime duel between two lone gunmen. It was a fast, chaotic burst of gunfire between groups at very close range, and it was over in roughly half a minute. That's the part Hollywood doesn't love. Real violence is rarely cinematic, and it's rarely clean. Another thing people miss is how firearms worked back then. The classic single-action revolver meant you had to cock the hammer for every shot. Reloading was slow, and gunpowder smoke could block your view quickly. Under stress, accuracy dropped hard. So the romantic idea of two experts calmly trading shots in the middle of the street just doesn't match what most records suggest. When you picture the Old West like a constant tournament of quick-draw champions, you're basically watching a story designed for drama, not a reflection of daily life in frontier towns. That naturally leads to the next myth. Because if duels weren't constant, then the question is, were people at least armed everywhere all the time? Number 2. Everyone carried guns everywhere. A lot of people still think every cowboy, gambler, and shopkeeper walked around with a revolver on full display, like it was as normal as wearing boots. The truth is more complicated. Yes, guns were common on the frontier, especially for travel, ranch work, hunting, and self-defense in remote areas. But common doesn't mean everyone was armed at all times, and it definitely doesn't mean towns just accepted it with a shrug. Many cattle towns and mining towns didn't want random visitors showing up drunk and armed, so they used local rules to limit carrying firearms inside town limits. In some places, travelers were expected to check their guns at a hotel, a livery stable, or with the sheriff or marshal, especially if they planned to drink or gamble. That detail alone flips the movie image on its head. The classic scene where someone storms into a saloon heavily armed is exactly what a lot of town leaders were trying to prevent. Another reality check is money. A decent revolver and enough ammunition to practice regularly cost real cash. A working cowboy was a wage worker, not a rich action hero, and many people simply didn't buy expensive weapons unless they had a reason. Also, the one perfect revolver idea is a simplification. Plenty of people relied on rifles or shotguns, especially for practical tasks. Handguns were convenient, but they weren't magic tools that turned every argument into a quick-draw contest. There's also the cultural side. Carrying a gun in town could signal trouble. If you were a lawman, that was one thing. If you were a stranger with a visible weapon, townspeople might read you as a problem walking in. So while the Old West absolutely had more day-to-day contact with firearms than many modern city environments, the idea of zero limits and zero social consequences is mostly a myth. And once you accept that towns made rules about weapons, the bigger lawless frontier image starts to crack. Number 3. The Wild West was lawless. No law is one of the biggest Wild West myths because it makes every story easier. Nobody's in charge, anything can happen, and the toughest person wins. In reality, the American Old West had plenty of law. It just didn't always have enough enforcement, enough staff, or enough stability. Territories had governors, legislatures, courts, and sheriffs. Towns elected officials. Federal law existed too, especially around mail routes, railroads, and interstate crime. The problem wasn't that law didn't exist, it's that the West was changing fast. Boom towns could explode overnight when gold or silver was found, and a small law office might suddenly be responsible for thousands of people, strangers included. In those conditions, law enforcement could be stretched thin, underpaid, and sometimes outgunned. That's how you end up with posses, volunteer deputies, and local justice systems that look rough compared to modern standards. Mining camps are a good example. Before formal courts arrived, communities often wrote simple rules, set up hearings, and enforced decisions because they needed basic order to survive. It wasn't pretty, but it wasn't no rules. Another overlooked point is paperwork and bureaucracy. A working sheriff didn't just ride around looking for outlaws. He served warrants, collected taxes, transported prisoners, handled court orders, and tried to keep the peace between neighbors who might be fighting over water, landlines, or livestock. You also had private security and detective agencies in the mix, especially when railroads and banks wanted protection. So when people say the West was lawless, what they often mean is the West didn't always enforce law the way a modern city does. That's very different from a free-for-all. The myth survives because it fits the outlaw fantasy. If there's no law, then outlaw behavior feels like freedom instead of crime.
Which brings up another popular misunderstanding: who the cowboys actually were. Number 4. Cowboys were all the same. The Hollywood cowboy is usually shown as a white American man with one standard outfit, one standard accent, and one standard personality. Calm, tough, and always ready to fight. Real cowboys were far more diverse, and cowboy culture itself came from multiple roots. A big foundation of cowboy skills, roping, riding styles, cattle handling, came from Spanish and Mexican ranching traditions. Vaqueros were doing this work long before the classic U.S. cattle drive era peaked, and their influence is built into the language. Words like rodeo, lariat, bronco, and stampede trace back to Spanish. The workforce was also mixed. Historians commonly estimate that a significant share of cowboys were black, often described in the range of about 1 in 5, and many others were Mexican, Native American, or of mixed background. After the Civil War, you had formerly enslaved people looking for paid work, and ranch work was one of the available paths. You also had indigenous cowboys, sometimes working on ranches near reservations or in the Indian Territory, and sometimes serving as highly skilled riders and trackers. Even the clothes weren't uniform. The big cowboy hat image is a later standard. In many places, people wore whatever worked: bowler hats, caps, felt hats in different shapes, sometimes even straw. Chaps, bandanas, and spurs were practical tools, not costumes. If you want American Old West facts that feel real, picture a rough job market with long hours, mixed backgrounds, and people dressing for weather and work, not for a poster. And once you see cowboys as workers instead of movie icons,
The next myth becomes easier to drop. The idea that cowboy life was basically non-stop gunfighting. Number 5. Cowboys lived for gunfights.
The word cowboy gets used like it means frontier warrior, but most cowboys were basically livestock laborers on horseback. Their day-to-day life was repetitive, exhausting, and focused on animals, not outlaws. On a cattle drive, the job was keeping a herd moving, finding water, preventing stampedes, and dealing with bad weather. On a ranch, it was fixing fences, breaking horses, branding calves, moving cattle between grazing areas, and handling sickness or injury in the herd. The biggest threats were often nature and accidents, not shootouts. A horse falls, a river crossing goes wrong, lightning hits near the herd, a sudden cold snap kills cattle, or a stampede starts at night. Those dangers don't look glamorous on screen, but they shaped real survival. Pay also mattered. Cowboys weren't usually rich. Many earned what today would sound like a modest monthly wage plus food and a place to sleep. That's one reason the always armed, always heroic image is off. A working cowboy didn't benefit from getting into gun trouble in town. It could cost him his job, land him in jail, or get him badly hurt. Also, the lone cowboy myth is exaggerated. Drives and ranch work were team efforts. You had trail bosses, wranglers, cooks, and riders assigned to different positions around the herd. Even when someone rode alone for a task, they were still part of a work system, not a solo action storyline. This doesn't mean the Old West was peaceful. It means cowboy life was more like tough outdoor labor with occasional bursts of danger. The people who actively chased danger for money tended to be outlaws, not regular cowboys, which is why outlaw myths got so much attention. Number 8. Saloons were non-stop chaos. A classic Wild West scene is easy to picture. Swinging doors, a piano, poker at every table, and a bar fight every 5 minutes. Real saloons were businesses, and most business owners don't want their place wrecked daily. Many saloons were loud and rough, sure, but they were also community hubs, places to get news, make deals, hire workers, and meet travelers. Some served food, some had billiards, faro, or other gambling games. Some were basically simple bars. Others were surprisingly upscale for their time, with mirrors, fancy woodwork, and entertainment. The always whiskey detail is also oversimplified. Beer was common in many towns, and so were mixed drinks and simple cocktails where ingredients were available. And the quality of alcohol varied a lot. Sometimes decent, sometimes harsh, sometimes watered down. Another myth is that saloons were the only social life. In many towns, you also had churches, schools, theaters, fraternal lodges, markets, and social events. Even in rough cattle towns, daily life included ordinary routines: work in the morning, meals, errands, and family spaces that don't show up in the Old West equals saloon stereotype. Dance halls and sex work did exist, and some towns had districts where that was concentrated. But treating every Western town as one giant vice party misses how varied these communities were. It also blurs a bigger reality. Entire groups of people are simplified or erased in the usual Wild West story, especially Native Americans, who are often reduced to one flat role instead of being shown as real nations with real histories. Number 9. Native Americans were one enemy. Pop culture often treats Native American like one single group with one culture, one lifestyle, and one relationship with settlers. Constant war. The reality is that Native American history in the Old West involves hundreds of distinct nations with different languages, governments, economies, and strategies for survival. Some peoples were plains hunters who followed buffalo herds. Others were farmers with long-established towns and trade networks. In the Southwest, you had communities with complex architecture and irrigation traditions. In the Pacific Northwest, some nations built economies around fishing and ocean trade. Even the famous teepee image only fits certain groups and seasons. It's not a universal native home. Their relationships with the United States and with neighboring tribes also weren't one note. There were alliances, trade, intermarriage, diplomacy, and, yes, wars. But the reasons varied. Land pressure, broken treaties, resource control, forced removal, retaliation cycles, and survival under extreme disruption. Another detail that gets ignored is Native participation in frontier systems. Many Native Americans worked as scouts because their tracking skills and local knowledge were unmatched, and they sometimes did this as a strategy to protect their people or gain leverage in a changing world. That doesn't make the history simple or comfortable, but it makes it real. The one enemy myth also hides the fact that the West was not just a story of cowboys versus Native Americans. It was also a story of railroads, federal policy, disease, migration, economic booms, and local politics. When those bigger forces get erased, the story turns into a cartoon. And once you realize how often the West gets turned into a cartoon, it becomes easier to question one of the flashiest cartoon characters of all, the lone bounty hunter.
Number 10. Bounty hunters were everywhere.
The image is familiar. A tough stranger rides in with a wanted poster, collects a bag of money, and disappears. Dead or alive gets treated like a normal legal option, and bounty hunting gets portrayed as a major industry. In reality, rewards did exist, and posters were real, but the modern idea of bounty hunters as independent roaming enforcers is heavily exaggerated. Most arrests were made by local lawmen, sheriffs, deputies, marshals, or by posses formed for a specific case. Rewards often went to people who provided information, not to a lone gunfighter who tracked someone for months. If a private detective agency got involved, like the kinds sometimes hired by railroads or banks, it usually looked more like organized investigation and coordination than a single person doing everything with a revolver. The legal side matters too. In most situations, authorities preferred suspects captured alive because they needed identification, testimony, and a trial. Killing a suspect could create new problems: witnesses, disputes over what happened, and accusations that the shooter was just settling a score. Jurisdiction also made the fantasy harder. Crossing county lines or territory lines could turn a simple chase into paperwork and negotiation, and it's hard to collect a reward if you can't prove you followed the law. The bounty hunter myth survives because it combines outlaw and lawman energy in one character. A person who uses violence but claims justice. Someone outside the system who still gets paid by the system. It's a perfect movie invention. The real Old West was shaped more by ordinary enforcement, local politics, and economic pressure than by lone freelance hunters collecting cash, one poster at a time.